Muted.
Sustainable Business Council. Thank you for joining us on this webinar on the business case for a national carbon tax. Myself and my colleague Zach Bernstein will be walking you through a number of slides if you're sitting at a computer. Otherwise, you'll be able to get a copy of this presentation later. So we'll also have some brief comments from Michael Green from the Climate Action Business Association in Boston. Michael's been working with us on state-based carbon initiatives, particularly in Massachusetts. And if you hear some banging in the background, we apologize for that. There is some construction on our building here in Washington, D.C. This afternoon. So let's move forward and let me describe a little bit about why ASBC is working on a national carbon tax. When we look at the macro problem of climate change, we've realized that one of the most effective and efficient strategies to address that issue is a national tax on carbon. Many economists, both on the right and the left, agree that a national tax would create substantial change in the behavior within the energy industry and would also produce substantial revenue that could be used for a variety of purposes. And a tax, as we'll discuss here in a moment, is seen by many as a very equitable and efficient way to deal with what is essentially a very large externality, that is climate change, and that is carbon pollution and greenhouse gas emissions that are being released and are not being accounted for in any real true economic manner. So we have developed a campaign that we're launching today. You can find more information about this on our website. We encourage you to, in fact, look at the website and sign on to our sign-on letter that is going to members of Congress. And what we're trying to do for the rest of this year and next is to build a large business constituency that will encourage Congress to take this idea more seriously. There are a number of initiatives already underway, and we're going to be part of this national effort to mobilize business. So let me, with that, turn it over to Zach, who's going to describe in some more detail what is a carbon tax and how it would work.
All right, thank you, Richard. Good morning / afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We're really excited about this new effort, and again, we hope that everyone will jump on board because we really do feel like this is an important thing that we can use, an important tool we can use to deal with climate change. So to start the conversation off, it's helpful to understand what exactly we are talking about. And, you know, we're talking about carbon taxes. It's pretty much what it sounds like. It's a per ton price on all of these fuels relative to their carbon emissions, which means that under a carbon tax, coal, which is considerably more carbon intensive than, say, natural gas, would probably have a higher price associated with that. That's the idea. The whole point of this is to build on a basic economic principle, which is if you raise the price of something, fewer people will use it. So this is something we've seen a lot with things like tobacco. There have been, you know, cigarette taxes that have been imposed over several years, and we've seen smoking rates go down. The same principle would apply with a carbon tax. If you add additional costs to it, then people will produce less of it. So that's the whole point of this as a way to deal with climate change. There have been a lot of conservatives starting to talk about this. It's not something that a lot of them necessarily in Congress have been jumping on board with, but a lot of conservatives really do feel that this is the best market option for a couple of reasons. One of which is, as we've talked about costs a lot in the past, there are a lot of costs associated with carbon pollution and climate change, which are not really being addressed at this point, not being put where they're supposed to be, on the producers. There are things that society right now, the economy and the country as a whole, are having to deal with. So this puts those costs where they're supposed to be. In addition, as we'll talk about on the next slide, it's less of a heavy-handed sort of maneuver. It's something that, you know, really relies on market pressures to make it work. There's been some discussion about what to call it, whether you call it a tax, which has a more revenue generation sort of connotation to it, whether you call it a fee, something that's recouping the costs. there's not a real significant difference in terms of what the ultimate policy will be, whether you refer to it as a tax or a fee, but there's obviously a lot of discussions about that, which can be gotten into a little bit more later. Okay, so the question, what does this have to do with something like cap and trade, which is something that's been in the news a lot. Of course, the Senate was discussing this a few years ago. The big difference between a carbon tax / fee, whatever you want to call it, and a cap and trade mechanism is how they exert downward pressure on carbon emissions. A cap and trade system, again, it's very much what it sounds like. You cap the amount of carbon emissions that can be produced in any given year, and this is a cap that gets pushed down over time. And for polluters, you get a certain amount of credits. You get to pollute a certain amount, emit a certain amount of carbon emissions. If you're emitting less than you were expected to, if you have permits left over, you can trade them to other polluters who might be polluting more than they're supposed to. But you have a set limit, and it's exerted, you know, as a force of. So this is what makes a carbon tax a bit more solution. With a carbon tax, you can pollute as much as you want, but you got to pay for it. So the market that the solution, you know, a company says, we're only able to pay this kind of tax, so we need to find new ways to cut emissions. A cap and trade takes that completely out of your hands. It says, you're going to pollute this much, and that's it, so get to work and find new solutions. So it's much less of a actual forceful hand pushing down as far as the mechanism goes. The carbon tax lets it all happen naturally, which is the way it's really supposed to be. Okay, so big question. How does it work? Well, this is where things get a little more complicated. This is not a cookie cutter thing. It's not a one-size-fits-all policy. There's a lot of different questions that need to be answered besides just, should we do a carbon tax? One is the price. Where do you set it? Do you set it at a point that is really low, really high? What are the benefits of those? And we'll get to that a little bit more later on. How fast does it rise? If you set a price at $20 a ton but don't do anything with it, at some point with inflation, it's going to mean less and less every year. So that's going to be important as well. What industries are you setting it on? Are you just setting it on a few, or are you doing it economy-wide? You know, are you just looking at the energy sector? Are you just looking at manufacturing? Or are you looking at everything? That's a really important distinction to draw in any potential legislation. Where do you set it? And here we're talking about, the big one is upstream versus downstream. Upstream, things like the mines where the fuels are pulled out of the ground, the ports where they're imported from overseas, things like that, compared to something like downstream. And in this case, you can think of, say, having the tax be levied when you fill up at the pump. And there's a lot more places where that could be levied. It's, you know, sort of more directly being added on to the prices that consumers pay. That's something that needs to be addressed. The big one politically, what is the money used for? And in this case, it's revenue neutral or revenue positive. Do you have a tax where all the money gets given back to consumers in rebates or tax cuts, or do you have it be revenue positive, where the money is used for infrastructure or to pay for other programs or pay down the national debt? That's something that politically is a major thing to deal with if you want to look at getting something actually passed. In terms of who's actually done these before, the list, as you can see, there are some, but it's a fairly small one. One of the ones that we look at very closely, and we looked at a lot when we were coming up with this campaign, is British Columbia. This is generally viewed as a great example of a successful carbon tax because it's done several things. It's brought down fuel usage. It's brought down corporate and income tax rates to some of the lowest levels in North America. And British Columbia's GDP over the course of this carbon tax, over the course of its existence, which was only late last decade, has outpaced the rest of the countries. This has been something that economists have looked at and said, it's worked. It's done everything we've needed it to do. It's cut our energy usage, and it hasn't hurt the economy because it's balanced it out with tax cuts. So that's been a very positive thing. Now, you'll notice on the list, one of these carbon taxes, Australia's, is no longer in place. Now, we wanted to show you this one chart, And I apologize if the numbers are a little small to read. This is basically a monthly counting of Australia's carbon emissions from their national electricity market. And you'll notice the red line there, which is July of 2014. Their carbon tax is no longer in place. It was repealed last year. And you will notice the carbon emissions from their before their carbon tax, were going down pretty significantly at a pretty good clip. And then carbon tax is gone and their emissions are starting to go up. So if the big question that we're asking about a carbon tax is, will it actually work? Here is some pretty significant evidence that says it will work. It will actually bring down emissions, and if you don't have one, those gains can be reversed pretty quickly. So that is very important evidence in favor of a carbon tax. With that, I will turn it back over to Richard.
Great, good. Thanks, Zach. So there is activity in Congress as well as at the state level on proposing a carbon tax. The bill that we're most interested in and are tracking is a proposal by Senator Whitehouse and Senator Schatz. And that proposal calls for a $45 a ton cost of carbon. That would be the tax that would be imposed in 2016. And it would rise 2% a year plus inflation. There is no finite period of time at which the tax would expire, but the premise of this tax is that it would cause significant adjustment in the market so that the price of fossil fuels would rise, and it would spur great investment in renewables and clean energy, and would then achieve the goal of reducing carbon emissions significantly enough to address it, to reduce carbon emissions by 2 to 3%. So that is one proposal that we've been looking at. At the same time, it's interesting that the White House earlier this year released its own estimate of what they considered to be the social cost of carbon. And that's an estimate of the value to society reducing carbon emissions, and they priced that at about $38 a ton. So, you know, Senator Whitehouse has $45, this is $38 a ton from the White House. There are other proposals being floated by advocacy groups as well as other members of Congress that have the price as low as $10. And in other countries, for instance, in Denmark, the price of carbon per ton is at $110. So you can see there's great variance here, depending on what your objective is to achieve. So the real question, and Zach alluded to this, is what is this money going to be used for? And those proposals vary a good deal as well. We'll go into this a bit more in a moment, but there are those that suggest that a tax on carbon could be used to offset corporate tax rates, so reduce corporate tax rates. Others feel that a tax should be given to workers. Others feel that money should be set aside to support disenfranchised communities or low-income communities that might be disproportionately affected by an increase in energy costs. So we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, but let me turn to Michael Green from Massachusetts, and Michael's going to give us a quick overview of some of the state-based initiatives on taxing carbon. And Michael, are you with us? Michael, are you there? I think we've taken you off mute. No? Okay. All right. Well, Zach, do you want to just walk through quickly some of these initiatives, and I can add to that?
Yeah. So as this slide indicates, you know, there's several different states that are already considering doing this, doing a carbon tax of their own. And, you know, a few examples here. We've got Massachusetts, and you see with this, you know, they're setting the price at a fairly low level, but at the same time, they are having it rise at a pretty solid clip, $5 a year, up to $40 a ton, so that you're actually going to have this price become meaningful, even if it starts at what would generally be considered to be a fairly low level. And here, it's pretty simple, revenue neutral. The rebates go back to residents and employers to help offset, say, higher energy costs. You've got Vermont, same sort of deal. They have, of course, a much higher ceiling for this than Massachusetts does. But again, you know, a lot of it's going to be offsetting things like tax cuts with the extra point of funding weatherization projects. So you can even bring down carbon emissions a little more that way by reducing energy costs. And that really helps low-income residents who, as we'll talk about, will have to deal pretty significantly with rising energy costs. Oregon, we put this in because it's a little bit earlier in the process. Here they're talking about coming up with a commission to come up with a plan to make sure that certain carbon limits are going to be met. They're a little bit earlier in the process. There's also campaigns up and running in Washington State and Oregon to try and push for carbon taxes. Those are looking more at ballot initiatives.
Right. Yeah, and I would just add to that that, again, in each of these states, the real key distinctions are what level to set the price at initially, and then what to do with the funding. And so you might imagine that, you know, there's a difference of opinion from conservatives and liberals about what to do with the funds. And so in a number of states, that's really the key issue. Increasingly, as Zach indicated before, there's an agreement that a tax makes sense economically, but the you know, where the rubber meets the road on this seems to be what do you do with the revenues that are raised. So Marvin, let's go to the next slide. And so, you know, there is increasing support for this idea of a carbon tax by large, mid, and small companies across the economy. And what many companies have already begun to, a number of companies have already begun to do is they factored it into their internal cost of doing business. So Microsoft, for instance, imposes a $6 a ton cost of carbon on their internal projects. So they're looking at what a tax of $6 a ton would be on the profitability of certain initiatives. ExxonMobil internally has a $20 per ton price of carbon, and other companies have done the same thing. And the reason they're doing this is, in part, they feel that federal legislation is coming at some point in the future, probably in the next few years, and they're also trying to begin to understand what the true costs of exploration, product development are. And thirdly, they're beginning to recognize that the investment community, institutional investors and stock markets, are beginning to look at what the real risk is and what the real liability is for companies that have tremendous exposure to carbon emissions. So, long story short, businesses across the economy are beginning to factor in a price on carbon. So let's move back to the issue of the economic impact of what a carbon tax would do, and we have a number of slides that Zach's going to walk you through.
Yes, thank you again, Richard. So again, as we've talked about, a carbon tax is about so much more than just saying let's put a tax on carbon. There are so many variables that have to go into this. The question of what a carbon tax is going to do for the economy, what kind of impact it's going to have, depends on a lot of those factors. However, we have some slides from a study from Regional Economic Models, Inc., REMI. This is a really great modeling organization. They've done a lot of work on carbon taxes in the past. They've worked on some information for Massachusetts previously. This study looks at a tax which, again, starts fairly low but rises at a good clip over time. It's set upstream, so where the fuels are pulled out of the ground, with money going to dividends. We'll go through some of these slides. The link is there. Again, we will send out this PowerPoint later, so I would absolutely encourage anyone who's interested to go to this site, take a look at the full report. We're just pulling out a few slides from this. So the first question, does it cut carbon emissions? Yes, period. The blue line in this case is the baseline. What happens to carbon emissions if we don't do anything? And as you see, it stays pretty consistent, maybe rises a very little bit over that 20-year period, but stays fairly consistent. And as you see with the yellow line, it drops significantly. It's cut just about by half within the 20-year period. So again, carbon taxes, they'll work. If you put a strong enough one in place, it will cut carbon emissions. Now, here's the thing. A carbon tax will raise energy prices. This is something that is going to happen. There's no real way around this. If you are taxing carbon fuels and carbon-emitting fuels in a carbon-intensive economy, there's going to be some changes in energy prices. So the whole point of a carbon tax is to incentivize a move away from carbon emissions, which means renewables, zero carbon or low carbon energy sources are going to start looking a whole lot better, and that's the whole point. So obviously, energy prices will go up, but you look at the electricity grid, you look at the electricity chart that we have here, there's actually going to be a time when the curve starts to slope back downward again. This is something that, you know, if we're able to really harness the power of renewable energy, we could debate about nuclear, for example, but, you know, other zero carbon fuels, this is a way we can start to bring the energy prices back down. But this is going to be a big economic impact for a lot of people, and we will get to the consumer impact a little bit later in these slides. But what is this going to do for the broader economy? Well, you're not seeing things. Employment will actually go up at the national level. We will see, you know, even larger and larger gains over the course of time. Over the baseline, if we put a carbon tax in, we'll see, under this scenario, projected growth of rising up to more than 2.5 million by 2035. This is actually going to create more jobs. And as we'll see in the next slide, it's actually going to be all across the country. These are 9 different regions, rather, that Remy was looking at. And again, all of this information is available on the website we linked to earlier. Just about every single region in the country is going to see job growth as a result of this. The only region that isn't is what they call the West-South Central region, which is Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. So this is a region that, you know, there's a lot of oil extraction there. It's worth noting, states like Texas, they've done really well at harnessing wind power. But this is a region, for example, that is going to have some work to do. They're going to have to find a way to really transition away from fossil fuels, because under a carbon tax, they might be you know, hurt more than other regions. And we see that with the next slide. Now, again, just about every region is going to see a benefit. The only one that isn't, and it's fairly pronounced, is the West-South Central region. But I want to draw your attention just very briefly to the last sentence of the paragraph down here. And as it points out, West-South Central is going to have a problem with this. Lots of energy production in that economy. And I'll quote the last sentence here. Its ability to maintain the same level of employment in the face of falling gross regional product involves a change in its industry mixture. A carbon tax is going to be disruptive to the economy, but it's a good kind of disruptive. It's a chance for us to actually move to other sectors that are going to have to be the future going forward, is to transition us away from the kind of economy we have. So how can they change their industry mix? Well, this is what a carbon tax will have. This is the impact a carbon tax will have on different industries. There's only 4 industries here that are showing any kind of job decrease. And some of these make sense. Mining, for example, is going to have a harder time. Utilities will see a little drop. But look at all of the positive growth in industries like healthcare, retail, food services, finance, and insurance. Climate change is a big risk to a lot of businesses. Insurers know that. There are so many industries that are going to see job growth far more significant than the job losses we're going to see in certain sectors. So yes, this will be disruptive to the economy, but there's a lot of growth potential here, and that is the key point. While some sectors may not come out of this very well, in a lot of cases, there are sectors like coal, which is already getting hammered, and it's getting hammered by market forces. Whereas a lot of these industries, like healthcare, there is huge growth potential there, and this gives us an opportunity to build on that. So basically, if someone tells you a carbon tax is going to be bad for the economy, you can just tell them, well, no, it's not. A lot of the economy is going to do very well based on this. Okay, now the most important part, how much money are we going to get from this? And again, we're talking about a tax starting at $10 a ton, rising $10 a year pretty consistently. So obviously, revenues are going to rise. We're going to see about $600 billion by 2035. Now there's a second line here, which is border adjustment revenues, and that's something we'll talk about a little more later in the PowerPoint. The border adjustment revenues are dealing specifically with countries that do not have carbon taxes. This is a key argument that a lot of people use relative to other countries. Border adjustment revenues, as we'll talk about, are a way to make sure that we're not handicapping ourselves that much, that we're, making sure that other countries that maybe aren't taking the same path are not going to be able to get an unfair advantage over us. And you see there, by 2035, we'll be bringing in about another $100 billion in those revenues. Now, is going to go, again, is dividends to families. And again, these dividends are going to rise significantly over time. This is monthly for a pretty typical family of 4, 2 adults, 2 kids, paying $50 a month, so about $600 a year for a typical family, and this is going to continue to rise. Significantly over time. This can make sure they're not overly burdened by them. It's possible under a carbon tax plan to have sort of means-tested benefits or more support for low-income communities, so that communities that are really going to be heavily affected by this if nothing is done will have the ability to endure this a lot easier. So we've talked a lot about the economic impact of this. As we said, though, there are a lot of different variables here. There's going to be a lot of different things to consider in any carbon tax legislation. And of course, another part of that is where it rise. What does the money get used for? We were talking about a $10 a ton tax rising over time. If we're talking about a $25 a ton tax, it could be $1 trillion over 10 years. Who knows? And of course, the big issue, what's the impact that we're going to have on small businesses, low-income communities, communities like coal miners, for example? So with that, it seems like a pretty good time to explain what we are looking for, and I'll turn it back over to Richard.
Great, good, thanks, Zach. So we've developed what we are calling a set of principles, and we have 5 principles, and they're built around a focus on having an impact, on having a meaning, and having a real having an impact is the first one. So let me start with, we want the tax to be comprehensive. We want it to affect all sectors of the economy. And we think that this is the most efficient way to cut carbon pollution. So what Zach has been describing is, there are a number of scenarios here, and you can see from state to state that there are different approaches of dealing with carbon emissions. One of the critiques of a cap-and-trade system has been that it's primarily focusing just on the utility sector, and the Clean Power Plan rules that EPA has issued recently, which is a critical step to address carbon emissions, is focusing just on a narrow slice of the economy, an important but still narrow slice. So our first principle is that the imposition of a tax has to be economy-wide. Secondly, we want to, as Zach said, set the price at a meaningful enough rate so that it truly effectuates behavior, both on the part of industry, on the part of producers, on the part of consumers. And so if the goal is to cut carbon emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025, we think the price needs to be set somewhere in the 30s. That $10 a ton probably won't get us there, but there are different econometric models that have different, have different findings. But we do feel generally that if the price is set too low, it's just not going to move the market, and it's not going to have a large enough impact, and it's not going to cause investors to begin shifting their dollars to clean energy technologies. On the other hand, if the price is set too high too quickly, that can cause a serious disruption in the economy. Third, as we said earlier, we want the tax to be set upstream, and EPA has identified about 2,300 high-intensity points across the country. Those sites account for, I believe, 75% of all carbon emissions in the economy. So the tax would be imposed on those sites, and then, of course, the impact of that tax would filter down throughout the economy, as Zach indicated, likely resulting in what we think would be a short-term increase in electric costs. Fourth, and Zach alluded to this, is we want to ensure that the United States isn't disadvantaged by introducing a carbon tax. So as we think about goods that come from other countries, if they don't have a carbon tax, then they find their way into the U.S. at a competitive advantage now, because they will be less expensive than goods shipped from this country that are now taxed with an additional tax of a carbon fee. So the way that would work is that exports to countries without a carbon tax get that tax rebated, and that imports from countries without a carbon tax would have that tax added at the port of entry. This is known as cross-border adjustments, and it's a well-recognized approach in trade policy, and one we think is really smart to ensure the U.S. isn't disadvantaged from being a first mover in this area. And finally, as Zach has mentioned a number of times, there's great debate about what should be done with the revenues. Conservatives that we've been talking to across the country who are in favor of a carbon tax want to make sure that the monies are returned to taxpayers or used to reduce corporate income tax, and we should note are adverse to increasing the size of government. So our current thinking is that we would want to use these tax receipts, which are quite substantial, in the hundreds of billions of dollars, to reduce income or payroll tax, that certain monies could be refunded to taxpayers through dividends. Certain monies could be used for very targeted strategic infrastructure development. And finally, that some funds could be used to support communities that are undergoing a transition, such as coal-based communities in the southeastern or the southwestern part of the nation, and that those funds would be used to offset what are probably going to be some adverse economic impacts. We are, I should note, open to the idea of corporate income tax reduction as well. Our political calculation is that, when this bill gets before Congress, there'll be a number of trade-offs. So right now we're trying to position sort of taking the high road in terms of using these revenues for those purposes I mentioned. So the next, let me just briefly here, as we're wrapping up, tell you a little bit about our presence going into the Paris Climate Summit. A number of us will be attending the summit, and a number of ASBC members will be there, including Patagonian, Ben & Jerry's, and Ideal Energy, and 1% for the Planet. So we have a few objectives for the Paris Climate Summit, which starts November 30th and runs for about 2 weeks. One is to promote the idea of carbon taxes at the national level. We don't think there's any chance of a global tax, so instead we'll be advocating for nations to seriously consider their own domestic taxes. And the reason for that is we think it's an effective way for those countries to control their own destiny. They can do what they wish with the money. Those different taxing regimes will, we think, really impact and reduce the amount of fossil fuels. Secondly, we're interested in a binding agreement so that countries actually make a firm, legally binding decision that they'll reduce their carbon emissions over time, and that for countries that fail to meet that, there'll be penalties. And finally, we'll be advocating for the idea of a green fund, which sets aside money to help developing economies transition. So moving ahead, we really need your support. If you're interested in this idea of a national carbon tax, if you think it has merit, there are lots of ways you can participate. You can first sign on to our letter that's noted on our website at that address. We're happy to work with you on an op-ed or a letter to the editor. Often we can, we can collaborate in drafting that and then placing that. We'll also be having a number of meetings on Capitol Hill in DC, as well as working with our state-based partners across the country to advocate for carbon taxes. And then we'll be doing some other thought leadership programs in the spring here in Washington, D.C., and encourage you all to join us in those as well. So the last slide just tells us how you can get in touch with Zach or myself, and really appreciate your interest this morning. And Marvin, why don't we move to some questions if there are any?
First question we have is from Susan Blockman. Won't there be a need for a bureaucratic infrastructure to address how the revenue will be distributed?
Yeah, so thanks, Susan. So under these proposals at the federal level, the Internal Revenue Service within the Treasury Department would collect this tax as they do any other national tax, and it already has. So given the requirement not to create a large new infrastructure, a new department in the federal government, everyone agrees that the Treasury Department should be responsible for this and would do a fine job.
And I would also add, depending on what is actually in the carbon tax legislation, any that might hypothetically get passed, if we're talking about something like a cut in the corporate tax rate or income tax rates, etc., that would be something that could be addressed in a lot of different ways that wouldn't require new bureaucracy. We could be talking about potentially a carbon tax as part of tax reform. There's a lot of different ways this could proceed that wouldn't require entirely new agencies, or even, for that matter, a whole lot of new efforts in any way. It's just marking, okay, this tax rate was X and now it's Y. So again, if it's a dividend, it might be a little bit different, but even then, the IRS does this sort of thing all the time. They deal with collecting and rebating taxes, refunding taxes. So this is something they're set up to do. The infrastructure already exists for this sort of thing.
And when Zach speaks about a dividend, there is an idea that if every taxpayer was actually refunded monies from a carbon tax, that could be done through an electronic transfer system, just deposited into people's accounts directly. So there are a number of scenarios, but all said, there is very little appetite for growing the government as it applies to this idea.
Okay, and we have a question or comment from Michael Green.
Good. Is Michael off of mute?
He is now off of mute. Michael.
Hey, Michael, go ahead. If we.
Okay.
What his comment is? Marvin?
No, we do not.
Okay, Michael, sorry for the technical difficulties. If you want to type that in, if you can shorthand it, we'll relay that to people.
All right, and then for the other folks who aren't familiar with the system, if you go to the right-hand side, you can either, 1, raise your hand, or 2, type in your question in the Dolly Loaf box. And we have 2 more questions here. Ben, I'm going to unmute you, and you can just pose your question. Well, I'm not going to unmute him. So Ben's question is, do any of the countries or provinces with existing carbon tax have border price adjustments in place? And then would border price adjustments also apply at the state level? Finally, any concerns with how TPP or TTIP might impact border price adjustments?
So let me start with the TPP. So the TPP is a Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement that you may have been reading about. It's an agreement between 12 nations, the U.S. included, and so it's unclear whether that agreement would abrogate, would diminish the U.S.'s ability to have this national tax. We don't think so, but it's a good question, and it's something we're looking into. That trade agreement has in favor of sort of a the majority will of the participants, but it's something we need to look into, and certainly the U.S. can go on carbon. As far as the cross-border trade adjustment,
as far as that, we haven't been able to find a whole lot of evidence of that. That would be something that we would want to go really in depth on, but we have not seen anything about that in the research that we've done on previous carbon.
And as far as what happens at the state level, where there's, I think, some precedents to support a state having its own tax on this issue, and that it would be upheld, and may decide that they want to say on this. Again, our notes convey some.
We have a question. George, right now.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the presentation. Now, the question that I have is, if you can expand more on the impact of on the increases, particularly Northeast, and what pushback from elected officials in the region.
George, there are as to the likely increase from a 4% best to 20. Those figures obviously really vary, and some of those figures seem to be loaded with political. I think
right.
It's costs in the Northeast, and particularly in we have a cost increase in propane or home fuel, heating oil. It's likely that would happen. So one of the ideas, in order to compensate for those short-term increases, is funding, and Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island actually has a provision in his communities to mayors to to actually use for price adjustments. So, there is a recognition that energy costs will probably increase. What we've seen seems to be a modest increase, in the sort of 5% range. Zach, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. Again, I'll just keep throwing this caveat out there. It absolutely depends on what the tax is of something like a dividend or a tax cut in order to sort of counter, in order to offset the energy costs, and also offer to consumers by saying, well, we recognize what the economics say about this, and that's why we're making sure that we're giving especially low-income communities a chance to get enough money back they won't be overwhelmed by this.
Yeah, and George, one other interesting observation that we'd make is that here in Washington, see there's a great amount of antipathy towards EPA's clean power rules, as there is antipathy in many state capitals by governors. So some think that a national tax like this would actually be more effective in addressing climate change than EPA's rules, and some have actually proposed that a trade-off could be made to reduce the efficacy of those rules and impose a tax. Now, we're not in favor of diminishing EPA's regulatory ability, but we do hear from colleagues that they would be happy to have a tax, but do away with EPA's rules. So that's a bit of a trade-off as well, and I can see Marvin's indicating there's another question, so we're going to jump to that.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, George.
Jennifer, you're now off mute. You can ask your question. Jennifer, we can hear you.
Jennifer, are you there?
Okay. Well, her question is there a place to access more information on Australia? What specific changes were occurring as emissions decreased, and subsequently, what changed again after the repeal?
Yes, I would say a great place to get more information on any existing carbon taxes. There's a great website called the Carbon Tax Center. They have a whole page on where carbon is taxed that goes into a lot of detail about all the places that have come up with carbon taxes, and also links to other websites on this. As far as what was happening in Australia both before and after, that's something I'm not 100% sure what the other factors of this were. But what we definitely seen when the carbon tax was repealed is an immediate shift back out. Correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but I would argue the fact that it happened that significantly and at that specific point, there very well may have been other factors involved here, but the downward slope of the emissions before the tax was repealed and then the upward slope afterwards, whether there are any what we might call confounding factors here, that's something we would have to do a lot more digging into, but I think it looks very much like the carbon tax is a significant factor, and a lot of people who have written about this and have paid a lot more attention to it would say the same thing. That's what we have found.
Okay, so we have one last question. A couple more. This one's coming from Sarah Severn. And Sarah, you're off mute.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marvin. I sat through a presentation the other day that was looking at all the tax regimes throughout the world, actually. They had every single one up, and they tracked what had happened to their emissions. And their viewpoint was, the RGGI program, which only applies to the electricity sector, has been very, very effective, whilst BC's carbon emissions are actually back up on the rise again. So I do think we have to make sure the analysis on past performance, as well as looking at the future modelling that Remy's doing, you really have to kind of dive into what has actually happened in some of these tax regimes. But But my question really is, with things like RGGI that have been proven to be very successful, and California's cap and trade program, how do you factor in what happens when you bring in a tax at a national level? How does that sort of fit in with those existing regimes?
Yeah, Sarah, before we answer that question, I wonder if you could just say just a few moments worth of detail on what's happening in Washington State and the work you're doing so people can learn about that.
Oh gosh, okay, very quickly, I'm working with Washington Business for Climate Action, which is a group of businesses supporting a price on carbon. We have so far remained sort of agnostic on whether there's support for tax or cap and trade, mainly because we have businesses on both sides of that. But what's happening in the state, it was referred to earlier, there is an initiative that looks as though it's going to qualify that will go to the legislature, which is based on the BC tax model with revenue neutral. At the same time, there's a group called the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy that's pulling together an initiative for the people that is more likely to be based on a fee and sort of dividend approach, but the proceeds would be allocated across a whole range of things, including investments in clean energy, as well as helping just transition and communities of color and those heavily impacted by carbon pollution. So it's all up in the air at the moment in Washington.
Okay, good, Sarah, thank you. So, Sarah, your question about how it would impact state-specific initiatives, you know, part of our rationale is to have a uniform approach across the nation that brings, you know, significant change to regions, you know, in the Southeast, in the Southwest that may be less willing to deal with this than you know, than California, Washington, Massachusetts. So you know, our sense is that those existing systems in California could stay in place, and they might need to be adjusted so that it doesn't become so cost. You know, there's not such a disadvantage in cost of doing business in California if they had their own cap and trade system as well as a national tax. So you know, it's not one or the other. My sense is that both could coexist, but they would need to be adjusted, and possibly in a state like California where the system, you know, is clearly yielding results, that the application of a national tax would have to be adjusted to make sense in California. So it's a great question and something we'll look into more.
All right, we have another question. Mike Mesa, go ahead and unmute yourself. There you are, and you can pose your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Okay, yes, I'm with Carbon Washington, and I agree with Sarah's assessment of the situation out here. It is all up in the air in Washington State, and Carbon Washington is the group that is behind the initiative to do a revenue-neutral BC-style tax, and we are very close to finishing our signature drive to qualify to send that to the legislature in January, and then if the legislature doesn't act, they would kick it to the voters next November during the presidential election. And what I wanted to, you answered a question I had earlier around what happened in Australia. So I have another question, which is related to the issue of revenue, and that is that Washington State is just as divided as the nation as a whole and the U.S. Congress in terms of the way our legislature, we have the Republicans have control of the Senate and the Democrats have control of the House and the governorship. And interestingly, what it's really coming down to here in Washington is a discussion over what to do with the revenues. And I'm curious what how you see that playing out nationally in Congress with people more on the progressive side who would like to use the revenue to invest in various efforts, as Sarah was pointing out, versus groups on the conservative side who would prefer to not grow revenue and at all and rebate all the money back to businesses and citizens. So how do you see that playing out? We're gonna probably watch it play out here in Washington in the spring. Curious how you see that playing out nationally.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and our sense is that there's not a large appetite for using these revenues to grow various social programs or have enlarged investments in renewable energy projects. So I think, particularly if Republican members of Congress are to get behind a national tax on carbon, they're going to focus, I think, primarily on reducing corporate and maybe personal income tax. And I think that that's really where the deal will come down to. There is willingness to provide funding for transition communities and communities that are disproportionately impacted as well. But overall, there doesn't seem to be a lot of political will to, direct monies specifically to certain technologies or to give money to the Department of Energy to run a new clean initiative. Zach, you want to add anything to that?
I would also point to, for those of you who might have been at our summit recently, we had Senator Whitehouse speaking along with former Representative Bob Inglis. And one of the things Representative Inglis said is there are a lot of conservatives who have what he called a trust deficit. So even if you do have a situation, they don't want to be growing the government. That's a given, and that's going to make it very, very unlikely, at least for the next few years and perhaps longer, that there's going to be real push for something revenue positive. And the point that Representative English made is we're going to have to work with conservatives to really truly convince them this will not grow the size of government in order to get them on board. I think the main point that brings across is, we're going to have to find a way to balance out what some communities might want as far as really wanting a carbon tax, but also wanting it to be revenue positive. The math is not there. The situation on the ground is not really conducive to that. And at least for a little while, it doesn't look like it will be. And the fact is, this is a policy that we really need to be pursuing right now because the climate is warming. We know this, and we don't really have the time to, wait around that much to see how things change. It would be great if we could shift that perception, but right now, the math really is not there.
All right. I think we're coming up to the hour.
Okay.
So let's finalize questions. We have one more question.
Okay.
This will be the last. The term carbon tax is always used. The term carbon tax is always used. Is there any effort to be sure that the fact that methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide when both are in the atmosphere?
Yes, there is. And I would point to Senator Whitehouse's bill, which actually does have a section on non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gas emissions. My sense is this is just a naming thing. Carbon tax rolls off the tongue a little better than greenhouse gas tax. But it is absolutely something. That's a very, very good point. Methane many, many times worse as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. That is definitely something we'd want to include.
All right.
Good, Zach, thank you. And thank you all for joining us again. We really look forward to your active engagement in this campaign. It's important that businesses weigh in on this, as we find on this issue and all other issues when business leaders speak out. It makes a huge difference here in Washington, D.C. and state capitol. So thank you all for joining us, and please feel free to be in touch. So have a good day.